Okay, so what we're going to do is have you, for anonymity, we're going to have you close your eyes, and I'm just going to ask, I want you to look at your page and see where you have the most check marks. Are your most check marks in biological, psychological, social, spiritual, or noticeable in some other way? And I only want you to raise your hand if that's where you have the most check marks, okay? If it's equal, then pick the one that you feel like is your most difficult area in dealing with relationships. And raise your hand. So close your eyes. Raise your hand if you have the most check marks for biological. Keep it up. Okay. Hands down. Raise your hand if you had the most check marks in the psychological section. Hands down. What's next one? Social. If you had the most check marks in the social section. Okay, hands down. And spiritual. And then the last one, noticeable decrease or strain with section. Okay. Eyes open. Okay, so this is how it panned out. We got 10 for biological, 10 for psychological, 3 for social, 3 for spiritual, and 9 for a notable decrease or strain with. So we have time here, but we're doing this to help you to see that, number one, you're not alone. You know, when you struggle, we should all struggle with our relationships, and that's why we're in this class, in different ways. We all struggle in different ways. That doesn't make us any more or less than the next person. It just means that we have to learn who we are and how to guard our own hearts. And that's what this class is about, guarding our hearts. So we're going to first open it up and let Mark lead us in a word of prayer.
All right, let's pray. Lord God, as we come before you, we are becoming thankful for the day we do have. Thankful for this opportunity to come out and just to learn different facets about interacting with others, and God, about how in this class how we can guard our heart. And Lord, I do pray for the workers, the different ones that are leading these classes. I do pray that you use them and speak through them words that's going to be a benefit to us, to help us to better glorify and honor you as we interact with you. Lord, we ask for you to use this time for our benefit, for your glory. And we ask in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, so we're going to get started. Welcome to Guarding Your Heart. My name is Logan Lanier, and I'm an Associate Professional Counselor here at Court of Three. And I have the privilege to work with Ms. April Mitchell, and she's our Director of Advancement here at Court of Three. I texted her last night, and I was like, I have no nerves about this. I was wrong. But we're glad to have such a big turnout, and God knows better than we do what He's doing in your life, so we hope that this is a benefit for you.
So this is called Guarding Your Heart, and y'all have heard some of these scriptures already today, but it's based on Proverbs 4:23 that says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. If we don't guard our hearts, no one else will. So, and it's scriptural. So that's why we're here. We want to guard our hearts because until we see sustained change either in ourselves or in the relationships in our lives that we're having some struggles or some difficulties with. So that's why we want to guard our hearts until we see a change. And we also need to understand that our heart is a trust muscle. It is a muscle that is always at work. It's busy and it gets tired and it gets weary, both the emotion and the physical and the spiritual. It's working all the time. So we want to guard our hearts because out of it flow the issues of life. There is a book that we like called Shepherding a Child's Heart. If you're interested in that one, that's out on the Quarter 3 bookstore. We use that a good bit in counseling here at Quarter 3 to work with parents and how for them to help their children. So Proverbs 4:23. These are just the topics that we're going to go through in this class. Talk about some guardrails and gates, and when Jesus set boundaries, our responsibility in relationships, some conflicts, and then how to set healthy boundaries, and then close it out, and hopefully have a little bit of time for some discussion and interaction.
So, in the past couple of years since starting working as a counselor, probably the amount of times that I say the word boundaries in a day has exponentially increased. So I find a lot of times that we struggle with really knowing what a boundary is and what a boundary is not. So boundaries give us identity. When you think of a boundary, think of a limit, think of a gate, so to speak. It opens and closes like these doors do. At the moment, it's keeping us in here, and it's giving us the identity of this is the Guarding Your Heart class. We open the doors, we go out later, we're changing that. So they define us from other people. Like a fence or a gate for livestock, for example, designates the area for the animals inside. The fence allows the animals to kind of roam freely in that area, but it protects them as well from the things that may harm them, or from straying outside to things that may come in to harm them, but also things that of them getting out and getting harmed in some way. So boundaries do that. They keep the good in and the bad out. Without the boundaries, like I used that visual a second ago, the animals could roam and go into dangerous situations, predators, away from home, get lost, etc. And we do that too. If we don't have those boundaries in place, we can get lost. We can get into harm's way.
Okay, I'm going to talk about what a boundary is not. A lot of times we have issues with setting boundaries because we're afraid of hurting someone else or hurting ourselves. So we need to understand that a boundary is not unbiblical. God set boundaries, and his very first boundary was in the Garden of Eden when he told Adam and Eve that they could eat of everything in the garden except for this one tree, right? So he set a boundary. And he is our example. So it's okay for us to set boundaries. It's okay for us to put a little wall around certain things in our lives with a gate. They are not mean. Boundaries, it says Proverbs 13:18 says, he that regardeth reproof shall be honored. So setting boundaries for ourselves actually increases the number of blessings that will come into our lives. Because if we do it God's way, then we're always going to be blessed from that. They are not mean. They are not selfish. It's not selfish. It is self-control. So instead of using the word selfish when you're setting boundaries, people will tell you, you're being selfish. No, you're exercising self-control. And you're controlling what you can control. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. They are not evil. It is just setting limits. Boundaries are not evil. It's just a way of setting limits. And it's a way not just of setting limits for yourself, but it's also a way to respect limits of others. We're called to set boundaries for ourselves, but we're also responsible for respecting other people's boundaries. Sometimes we don't do that. They are not unloving. Boundaries are not unloving. Separation protects that love. Sometimes that's hard, but sometimes we have to separate to protect the love. And just remember, they're not manipulative. A lot of people use them that way. They can be manipulative. And some people use boundaries to be manipulative, but they shouldn't be that way. It's not to impose your own perspectives and your own desires. It is designed to protect you as well as the others around you. If you don't teach them how to respect you and what your boundaries are, then they don't know where your limits are. So you have to communicate that. There's going to be a class a little bit later today about communication, which is one of our weaknesses as well. But if we don't communicate it, then we can't understand that. So our model is God. So always look at his example to decide, how we're going to set those boundaries. All right, so I'm going to talk about when Jesus set boundaries. We had a discussion earlier today, and Clay covered very well the one flesh marriage, Genesis 2:24. And there is a page in your packet in here. We're not going to go page by page in that thing. This is just a resource for you. Y'all can take some time later to look at that and go through it, some ways to do some setting some boundaries. But in the one flesh marriage, I'm just going to share an example of something that my husband and I have said as an example, as a boundary. My husband travels a lot. He's on the road, so he's away from home for a week at a time, maybe 2 weeks at a time. And early in our marriage, I would have nightmares about, he stayed in hotels, and I was always worried about, is he cheating on me? It would be so easy. You just have those fears. And that come from a place of my past. It wasn't him, it was my own insecurities. And so, and then when he would get home, or when he would call me that night, I'd say, I had a dream last night, and I would get so angry. And it's just a dream. But I would get so angry. And so I had to explain to him why I was getting angry, why that was a problem for me. So when he would travel like that, he's with businessmen. He's not be with business women. We all have careers these days, and so they would go out to dinner, and then he would call me from the restaurant, and I would hear all this loud stuff. Okay, who's there? Okay, well, I haven't micromanaged or anything, but I hear all kinds of folks. And it's like 10 o'clock, dinner's done, time to be back home in the hotel room. And so I had to communicate to him that, I'm okay with you going and having dinner with your colleagues, that's not a problem for me, but it does, when you stay until 10 and 11, and you're just hanging out and chatting with men and women, it opens up a door for possibility of temptation. It gives the image of, it made me feel insecure. And that's what I think. When you stay there that long, I feel insecure in our marriage. I'm afraid that you might be tempted to run around or whatever, being unfaithful. And so once I communicated that to him, he was like, I can do that, I get that. And I turned it around on him and I said, okay, so if you were at home and I was out at dinner and I called you, would that bother you? Yes, it would. So we set a boundary early in our marriage that would not be something we would do. He could go to dinner, eat 8 to 9, 9:30 to 10, whatever. But he would call me when he left and get back in the room. So that was just a boundary that we set. Another boundary we set, like here at Quarter 3, I'm the director of advancement, so I go and talk to all these people. And I told Clay when I first came in, I said, I will not ever go out to dinner to schmooze a man. Not doing it. I'm out there, trying to fundraise and all this good stuff. But if we ever go to dinner, then either Clay and Doris are going with us, or my husband's coming with me, or somebody's coming with me. I'm not going to ever go to dinner alone. And he's like, oh, of course, I would never ask you to do that. But I felt the need to set that boundary. So in a marriage, you have to decide where your minds are. What is it about, your team? You're a team. You're a one flesh. You have that one flesh marriage. And I was watching a little reel TikTok where it had some blue Kool-Aid and yellow Kool-Aid, and it just did a very, very practical visual image of marriage. When you combine the color blue with the color yellow, what happens? It becomes green. And once it becomes green, can you pull the blue back out? Nor the yellow. So you are, a one flesh marriage means you are blended. You are together. You are mixed. We are not April and Mac. We are the Mitchells. Okay, so we're one. And all the decisions that we make need to be made together. So that's a one flesh marriage.
So Luke 5:15 and 16 is probably one of my favorite go-to scriptures when looking at setting limits on myself. Boundaries they are relational, but we also need to prioritize and set boundaries with ourselves, set limits with ourselves. So just to paraphrase these verses, 15 says, the fame of Jesus was spreading and people came to be healed by him and to hear him teach. And so as I remember reading this the first time, just in context and thinking, wow, responsibility. Like all of these people are growing, people are coming, the pressure is getting more. He was fully God, but he was also fully man. So he experienced that exhaustion. So then verse 16 says, and Jesus withdrew himself into the wilderness to pray. And I remember reading that and thinking, did he just say no? Did he just say, hold on a second? Like, he has all this duty and this pressure and this responsibility, and he's saying, hold on, I'm going to prioritize my time with the Father before I can do what I'm needed and called to do. And that is refreshing. That is something I think about every single day. Jesus withdrew, and Jesus spent time with the Father before he came back to the duties and the burdens and the pressures of life.
The last one, provoke not your children. Ephesians 6:4, most of you are familiar with that scripture. It says, provoke not your children to wrath. But what we are, and that means, provoke not your children to anger. As parents, we're not to poke your prod at them until they get to a point where they are bringing conflict into the home. Today in our society, if you turn on a cartoon, you're going to see a cartoon where the children are portrayed as being so intelligent and smart, and the dad is the dumbest person in the house. That is completely contrary to everything we heard this morning. And so I would caution you to set some boundaries with your children as to what is going into their eyes and into their ears. Be careful, because it is powerful. They're watching it, they're hearing it, they're more intelligent than we give them credit for, and they will do what they see and hear. They will mimic that, and they do that as well as parents. What we do is say, if we're not, again, I'll refer to what Brother Chris said this morning, we have to be very intentional when we are parenting. We have to know where the boundaries are with our child rearing. For example, with our children, I have a 23-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 15-year-old. And we did not allow them to have a phone until they were 16 and were driving. And they thought that was the end of the world, because everybody has a cell phone these days, right? But that was a boundary in our home. Another boundary when they did turn 16 was we had a firewall there where they could not get on the internet until they were 18. And they thought they could on the computer at home when they're doing school, some in homeschool, but they could not do it without us being able to take on it. They were not allowed to have social media until they were 18 years old. And again, they thought that was awful. No Snapchat, no Instagram, none of that. But my 23-year-old has come back to me after being in college for 4 years and said, Mom, I'm really glad that you set that boundary. I don't want it. And now he's not interested. He has one. He has a Facebook account because he had to, because of his degree in college. But he rarely ever gets on it. And he rarely ever commutes. And I told him, call me helicopter mom if you want. But I told him, I said, if I ever see you on social media, post anything, I will call you out. I will always be mama. And I will call you out. If it's unbiblical or if it's ungodly, you just need to be cautious, because once it's out there forever. So when you're parenting, they'll tell you they don't want the boundaries, they don't want the structure, but they do. It gives them direction, it gives them comfort in knowing that you care enough to set the boundaries, that you set the perimeters around that relationship. And one day they'll come back and say, I'm glad you did. As long as you're following it by God's time. It's not about what Mac and I chose to do. We were trying our best to do what God had put on our hearts as parents to model for them. And we were just trying to do our best to follow that.
So now we're going to ask you guys to do an interactive activity. So in your resource packets, you'll see an empty sheet with 2 circles. It's called the circle of control. Like we mentioned earlier, boundaries give us identity. And so part part of that identity and part of being able to set boundaries is to understand what we are actually responsible for and what we are not. So with this activity, what we're going to ask you to do is first, in the little circle, is the things that we can control, things that we are responsible for. And in the outer circle are things that we are not responsible for and have no control over. So take a moment to kind of jot down, either generally or personally, what are some of those things that you have responsibility for, have control over, and then what are some things that are out of your control.
That's the point.
Ready? So, what are we responsible for? Our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions.
Ourselves. And you'll just take your paper and do this. That's what you're learning. You. You don't have control over anything outside of that little circle.
We like to think we do.
And we work hard, a lot, trying to control all of those things frivolously. So narrow your focus.
So, boundaries build identity by defining our responsibilities. Galatians 6, 2 and 5. So, we find in verse 2, he says, bear ye one another's burdens. Come down 3 verses later, every man has to bear his own burden. Confusing. But we know Scripture doesn't contradict itself. So, I like the way that Henry Cloud in the book Boundaries, he kind of elaborates a little and he defines the word boundaries. So in verse 2, he's talking, bear ye one another's burdens. So those things that we cannot bear ourselves, those trauma, those losses, that grief, that things outside of our control. We have to lean on one another. We have to lean on God to help us in those situations.
That's why he admonishes us in Scripture to, as the older women teach the younger women. The older men are to teach the younger men, in Titus chapter 2. He gives us exact directions on how to do that and the ways that we can do that. So as we gain experiences in life, we can help other people. But if we're not taking care of ourselves first, we've got an empty bank that we're trying to pull from to help people. So you've got to examine yourself first, and you're try to deal with your own burdens. Get that plank out of your own eye. We'll get there a little bit.
So verse 5, every man has to bear his own burdens. Our own responsibilities, our own daily loads, our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own actions. That's what we're bearing ourselves. So my job title here is Associate Professional Counselor. And so for the past couple of years, it's what I've been doing, working with clients one-on-one. But April's job here is advancement. That's her daily load, her daily responsibilities. I can't switch places with her. She has the talents to do what she does, and I have the talents to do what God has given me. So I have to bear those. I can't call her up and say, hey, take my clients today. I just don't feel like it today. You do it. That's not her job. That's not, I have to bear that load. So when we're looking at these two verses and we're defining what we're responsible for, we're looking at verse 5, those daily loads, those daily responsibilities and responses. Then there's another word. So we also have a responsibility to others, to love them, to show grace, to speak truth, to disciple, to instruct, to teach, to serve. All of those things we have a responsibility to do, but we are not responsible for the outcome of those situations, just the work that we put into it.
Don't let that sink in. That's hard to remember sometimes, especially as a parent, you know, and as a spouse. You want to fix all the problems of your spouse, you want to fix all the problems for your children so that they don't have to, you know, have any kind of troubles in life, but that is impossible. All you can do is speak truth into them, show them where the truth is found, and then pray. A lot of time in prayer for one another.
So now we're going to talk about boundary conflicts. So in Matthew 7, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus kind of calls out some hypocrisy, and he says, why are you, and I'm going to paraphrase slightly, he says, why are you paying so much attention to the mote that's in your brother's eye, and you don't even know that there is a plank in your own eye? And then, you know, with that rebuke, he gives a righteous solution. First, take the plank out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly to help your brother who has the mote in his eye. So pause on for a moment, and let's kind of talk about this. So we know that, and we do this all the time, we pay so much attention saying, well, they did this, they did that. But we're not even focusing on how our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions are affected and playing a role in that. We're quick to notice their behavior and assume their intentions, but we don't think about ourselves. So the answer that Jesus offers here is to examine ourselves first, identify where our boundary conflict is, why we're being affected this way, before we cast blame on other people. So we're going to use this quadrant here and kind of explain what these conflicts are. So this is coming out of the book Boundaries by Henry Cloud. So we have a couple of, so starting in the top left quadrant, the conflict that cannot say no is called a compliant. Saying no is bad. They say yes to bad. Those walls are kind of porous. It's a fence that doesn't really work. Maybe it's, sure, I can hang out with this group of people and not be influenced. Or, sure, I can watch this thing and it's not going to have an impact on me whatsoever. Or maybe it's, yes, I can do all of these 10 service projects and it will not exhaust me at all. So kind of like can't say no and says yes to the bad things. And boundaries are supposed to keep the good in and the bad out. And then can't say yes, the non-responsive. They don't hear the needs of other people. They don't see the wrecked walls. They kind of turn off that eyesight. They're kind of blind to it, like, where am I? So, does not hear the needs of others. Instead of responding to brothers and sisters in need, as they are responsible to them to do, they are seemingly oblivious to any problem whatsoever. And then we look at the other side.
Okay, so I've got the controller, and that's the person who cannot hear no. They have no respect for anyone else's boundaries. Somebody says maybe, and they say, oh, she said yes. Somebody says no, and they hear maybe. They don't hear a no, ever. They are seen often as those bullies. And they come in two different forms. They can be either aggressive in their controlling or they can be manipulative in their controlling. So let's talk for just a second about those two different things. The aggressive controller is somebody that does not listen to anyone else's boundaries. They live in a world of yes, perpetual yes. Everybody said yes. The biblical example for that would be somebody like Peter. He was very aggressive. Jesus said, this is going to happen. He said, no, Lord, it's not going to happen. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. That's the controller. That's the aggressive controller. Somebody like Peter. Now, Peter was, he was a good guy, right? We know he was a man of God. But he just had that dominant personality. The manipulative controller is somebody that's less honest. They're going to be more quiet and sneaky about the way that they're controlling you. They're going to try to persuade you out of your way of thinking and into their way of thinking. They're going to convince you that the way they're thinking is the only way. They're going to use guilt messages. And my favorite example of that one that the book Boundaries talks about is Tom Sawyer when he convinced everybody to do the whitewashing on the fence, They all thought they were doing him a favor, So, and he totally convinced them that we don't have a good old time that day, right? So, and then biblically, that would be somebody like Jacob, who stole his brother's birthright. He was manipulative in that. Now, eventually, God did work on him when he spoke to him, but Jacob was very much a manipulative controller in the beginning. So that's the controller. They're bulldozers, they wreck the walls, they don't care, they have no regard for anybody's boundaries. That's not good. That doesn't mean they don't have any good qualities. Those are your, speaker experience. That's typically your type A type people who are go-getters. They're going to accomplish a lot. They're going to be your leaders a lot of times. They get things done, but they do it at the cost of whoever's around them, So they have pros and cons. Each one of these personalities have pros and cons. They're not all negative. What we're trying to help you see is to look inside and see, what is motivating you? Is your motivation control? Is your motivation to just comply and always say yes? The avoidant person says no to the good. There was an example in the Boundaries book with that one where there was like a Bible study group of 5 or 6 couples, and the lady and husband that was hosting it in their home, they were all sitting around, and for weeks they'd just been kind of, I don't know if y'all have seen that circle of communication, but you start out and you talk, how's the weather today? Everybody does that. And you move on a little bit closer and you say, well, I believe Trump should have won the last election. That's an opinion. When it gets on down into the nitty-gritty, you're talking about feelings and needs. And so in that Bible study group, it got down to a point where everybody started being a little bit more transparent, and the discussion turned into something a lot more serious. And this one female host, they were all going around the circle sharing, and it got back to her, and she was like, I don't have anything. Let's go eat. That's the avoider. They'll talk all day long about your problems, but when it gets back to theirs, they're like, nope, got my little ball, not doing it. So they say no to the good. Even though that was a Bible study, it probably would have been very, very therapeutic for them to be able to open up a little bit and get some insight from other people who are experiencing some of the same things. They won't do it. They'll shut down. So they won't ask for support ever, and they see their boundaries as walls. They have no gates in it whatsoever. It's just a wall. Don't come in here. So we said Alcatraz for that one. So they just can't see the yes. They can't hear your yes. Let's see what. They need to create a gate. The avoider does. They need to open up and let some good in. And they need to let some bad out. If you hold all that bad in, that's when you end up somewhere like 4 or 3, where you're needing counseling because you let it all fester and fester and fester and fester. Eventually you explode, and then you're up here looking for love. Need help! I can't do it anymore. Okay, so we'd like y'all to take a second now and just don't out loud, unless you want to. Think about, one thing we didn't say is that you're not locked into any one section of this. Like, I'm kind of a compliant avoidant, and I'm that Rachel. I'm the compliant with everything else. I'm like, yeah, I can do it. I can do everything. Superwoman. But then, if anybody comes to my house and says, let me fix you a dinner, you're not feeling well. I'm like, oh, no, I'm fine. I got this. I can cook my own dinner. No, I don't need you. So you can cross over. You can be more than one. You don't have to be just one. So just take a second and reflect about where do you think you fit. You don't have to talk about that. Just ponder. That'll help you determine where you need to start examining yourself. What is it you need to work on? Does anybody want to share? Okay. Y'all all avoid us.
We were saying you may not see yourself like other people see.
That is very true. Yeah. That's very true.
Different relationships might have different boundary conflicts.
Okay, so we're going to do a little role play, Logan and I. I'm going to be her mom, even though her mom is sitting in this room.
I'm a counselor, not an actor.
Me too. I'm not a counselor, but I'm not an actor either. I'm going to be her mom, Sherry, and a mom. She's Sherry. She's my daughter, and I am going over to her house to visit. The first role play is going to be an example of no boundaries, and then we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it with the boundary. Okay, so this is an example. Right?
Hi, Mom. You can't imagine how much I enjoy your surprise visits. I was wondering, while we talk, would you mind if I work on Amy's costume for her school play?
Sure, you know I would be the last one to intrude on your family time. I mean, since your father died, I miss our family time so much more. How could I deprive you of that for yourself? I don't really understand why you don't bring the family to see me anymore. I'm just this lonely old lady that gave her life for her children. Who would want to spend time with me?
No, Mom, no. That's not what I meant at all. It's great to have you over. We'd love to visit more, but we haven't been able to. I'm so glad you took the initiative. I can do this at any time. Why don't I make you some coffee and you make yourself comfortable?
Okay. Come on in. And I make myself at home for 3 hours. Okay, so that's no boundaries. What did I do to her?
Manipulate.
Yes, I manipulated her. What else did I do to her?
Yep.
I made her feel guilty. I imposed on her. Did y'all see anything else? I did not listen to anything she said. Good point. We talked about that earlier today. Didn't hear anything she said. I was only focused on what my needs were.
So what boundary conflict was the mom? Yeah. What about Sherry? What boundary conflict was she?
Not responsive.
Unresponsive. Well, now, non-responsive kind of just doesn't do anything to them.
Kind of like blinders.
Yeah, there's
to
some
people.
people, they don't even see anything or anything. So it could be, and like there is some crossover, but I would see her as more of a compliant person than a non-responsive. Okay, so we're gonna try it again. Listen for the differences. All right.
Hi, Mom. It's good to see you. I'd love to visit with you, but this is a really bad time. I'm helping Amy work on a science fair project, and she needs my full attention. You're welcome to come in and watch, or I can call you tomorrow and schedule a time to get together.
It's just as I've always known, dear. Who would want to spend time with a lonely old lady like me? Well, I'll just go on home and be by myself.
I'll call you tomorrow and we can schedule something.
parents get the same option.
What was, she set a boundary, but what was it?
She
Sorry.
stuck to it.
Oh, she what?
She stuck to it.
She stuck
Kept
to
her
it.
boundaries. She
Okay,
didn't let
so,
them.
so what was the boundary she set?
That was.
Now's not a good time.
I'll call you later.
I'll call you later.
Plan.
We'll schedule a time to get together. And mom,
You can watch if you want.
you can watch if you want, you can come on in, but we're doing a soccer
I'm
project.
not stopping for you.
Right. Okay, so how did mom respond to that the second time? Hurt. But did she go in? No, she left. So even though she didn't want to respect the boundary, my daughter did not give me the option.
Reluctantly respected.
Reluctantly respected. She set the boundary initially. I rebutted and tried to control it and guilt her again. She came back and reiterated what the boundary was. So you have to kind of be a broken record for a little while until they believe you. They gotta believe you.
Kind of like the children.
Yes, it's exactly like parenting children. Say it 1,000 times until they figure it out. Okay. Oh, I'm the first on this one, okay. So now we're gonna write down the role play. What were, some of Sherry's values, what was she valuing in the role play that we just did? Family time, her child. See anything else?
Her studies.
Her studies, and her child's studies. It's important that we help our children. What else did she value? Did she value her mom? Yeah, of course she did value her mom. It's hard to say no to mom, right? It is hard to say no to mom. Living that now. You know, the other mom would have children at home. We deal with that now. They just kind of show up. Hey. Oh, okay. So values. The first thing you need to do when you're beginning to set your boundaries is determine what are your values. What do you value? Is your family time important to you? Who are you going to let come into that? No. Is mom allowed? Yes. Is she allowed at certain times? Yes. Is it okay to say no, mom? You can't come right now? Yes. All those are okay. You determine what your values are. What is it that you're needing? Is it your spouse time, like your date night that we were encouraged to do earlier? Do you need to guard that? Yes, you do. So determine your values. That's the first step.
So we didn't see the second step really played out, but I'm going to make an assumption here and say that Sherry sat down with her counselor and planned out what to say, using the communication model to try and figure out how to best communicate this with her mom. So in our resources, you'll see an assertive communication style kind of format for you. So looking back at Sherry's response here and setting this boundary, we can see her using I statements, we can see her reinforcing the relationship, offering a compromise to help kind of have a win-win situation here. She was full of grace and full of truth in setting this boundary. Assertive communication really follows those simple guidelines, speaking up for needs and wants, coming up with a win-win, taking into consideration the needs of others as well. Because we're responsible for ourselves, but we also have a responsibility to other people. And she did that in communicating her boundary. She valued the time enough with her mom to say, let's set up some time to do this later when you can have my full attention. She had a responsibility to her children and her mother, but she also had a responsibility for herself to manage her time and to set limits in order to best be able to give of herself the way that God intends for us to. So in step 3, you'll also notice in her example, we don't often receive the most humble and gracious response when we set a boundary. Mostly we probably won't, and that's one of the fears that we have about setting boundaries is the response we're going to get. Does this mean that we should retreat back to being passive or aggressive or passive-aggressive? No, because we're responsible to God for ourselves. So we'll get more into that later of how we're met with pushback. So just notice how she maintained that assertive communication style and simply restating and communicating her boundary again. It wasn't hurtful. She didn't retreat to being passive aggressive. She simply restated it full of grace and full of truth.
And then always remember, step 4, fortify the relationship. That's your mom. You're not trying to hurt her. You're just simply trying to set a boundary there around the family time. So stick with your guns, follow through. You gotta make a believer out of them. They gotta understand that you are serious. Because if you cave, you're getting nowhere. You gotta be consistent with it. But always go back and honor your word. What did she tell me she was gonna do? She said she was gonna call me tomorrow. So tomorrow I'm expecting a phone call. If I don't get that phone call, then I'm hurt. I'm mad. I'm guilting her into other things, whatever. I'm gonna take some action because I'm mom, and I'm gonna be upset with her. So always take the time to go back and reestablish that relationship. Now, not every relationship needs to be salvaged. There are some people in your life, and there are some sections in your in this packet that talk about toxic relationships. There's toxic types. You need to recognize those types of people in your world too. These type of people need boundaries sometimes, where you may not be able to establish that relationship. And you have to learn who those people are and when it's time to cut them off, and to cut them off for good. That does not mean that you can't be cordial and say hello and be kind. That doesn't mean that. I'm not saying that. You don't want to be pharisaical and have a holier than thou attitude about it. You just want to set that firm boundary in place. This is not someone that I can fellowship with on a daily basis. I need space here. So recognize that we're not just talking about familial relationships. We're talking about all relationships. Inside the home, outside the home.
All right. So now it's your turn. So we're going to take some time, and you guys will have the chance not to do this up here, but where you're sitting, to kind of practice what it looks like to kind of set a boundary, identify a boundary conflict. We're not going to make this super hard, so we're going to talk about setting boundaries with ourselves. So our topic for this role play is surrounding areas that we need boundaries with ourselves, like I just said. The topic is self-care. That's a big topic in our culture today. It's misconstrued a lot as being selfish, or it's taken in a worldly direction when it wasn't intended to be. So a lot of times we have that confusion, especially in the church. So take some time and kind of think about how might you say no to those good things that God has for us. That rest, that time, that refreshment. So identify one boundary conflict surrounding how you might deprioritize your walk with God and your body, soul, spirit, in favor of being busy, exhausted, and burnt out. Do you have something to add to that?
I was just wondering if it was clear. She kind of went fast. We've got in the book, let's find the page. There's more pages about setting boundaries, weak boundaries, what healthy, unhealthy boundaries and healthy boundaries look like. If you keep going, boundaries in context. And if you want to look at this page right here where it says boundaries in context, it's got different ideas. Boundaries in love, boundaries at home, at work, with friends. You can pick one of those scenarios if you want, or you can do the one that love is just internally, like getting up and reading scripture every morning is important. How am I going to protect that boundary? So you could do something like that. But in the back here, it says, what are some non-negotiable boundaries? Pick, and we'll talk about that more later, but pick something that's kind of safe first. Always start with somebody safe, your spouse or a really close friend that you can practice setting boundaries with. So on this last page back here, pick someone and come up with a boundary. Think about, go through the steps. What are your values? What is it that you're trying to protect? Number 2, what was that one?
have a
Plan what you
plan,
want to say. Number 3,
communicate.
communicate it to them, and then number 4, go back and restore that relationship or fortify it. Okay? Just take a couple of minutes. Keep it simple today because we don't have a lot of time.
It's a boundary.
Okay, somebody got a good one? Anybody brave enough to share one that you may have tried or that you would like to try?
Read that much, yeah. Leaving the getting late. You got your extra bed, and she's gonna wear out late it is, I tell you what, a little too late for me to be leaving the wife.
Did y'all hear him? He used one of the scenarios that was already in the packet and then how to respond to that. You think he's gonna get upset if he says that to him? Not if he's his friend, not if he respects his relationship, with him and with his wife. Y'all?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, share.
At work, there's these ladies that's, Lynn, let's go see Magic Mike.
Oh.
And I said, no, my wife ain't getting involved in that. No, she ain't doing that. Did I say any boundaries or that?
Did you set any boundaries? I think so. You're setting a boundary with your relationship. You don't want
I
her,
don't want her involved.
you don't want that
And she
going in
shouldn't
her
as a
eyes.
Christian. She wouldn't go either.
And
I'm the
that's-
Magic Mike.
And he brings out a good point though. Because years ago, as I get older, I'm getting better, but when I was younger, I was very compliant, everything. I was like, yes, I can do it, I'll do that, I'll do this, everywhere. And after a while, I just got really exhausted, and my husband was tired of me being exhausted. And he said, you can say no. And I said, yeah, it's so hard to say no. And so he said, well, use me for an excuse. Tell him that I don't want you to do that. I was like, you're okay with me saying that? He said, no, I'm absolutely okay with you saying that. So that was a protective thing that he did for me. And I was very appreciative because then I could put the blame off on him. That might sound ugly to some of you guys, but it works for us. He was willing to do it. He's okay with being the bad guy. And that's kind of how we did that. So to me, that's how I saw that, as you kind of
That's a
said.
loving husband, right?
That's right. That's being a loving husband. You're
Thank
protecting your wife's eyes and her heart and her mind. So. All right. So we're going to move on. We're getting short on time. So we're going to talk about some things to remember as you leave from here and you go through this packet and you work through how to set boundaries, what healthy boundaries are, unhealthy boundaries are. there's gonna be some issues that you're gonna come across. So this is the last thing we're gonna talk about here.
So when we begin to set boundaries with people, it's important to remember that people who are not used to boundaries are probably not going to react with the most Christian attitude. We may have this pushed back in the form of anger or guilt messages like we saw in our role play. So it's hard when we do the work and we've built up the courage to communicate with this relationship and communicate the boundary, and then to have another obstacle. That's hard. It takes time, it takes consistency, courage, and we're going to talk about practice in a second, but it takes practice too. So remember that setting your boundary is a good thing, but that pushback and that reaction may not be about you, it may be more about them.
And what she said here is important. Others need time to understand, and that's why